Okay, if I could have conversations come to a good stopping point. And conversations to a close. Great, I just had a teachable moment there. You guys really got into that piece, so thank you for taking the time to do that. I'm going to actually, as I was looking at this, kind of an on-the-fly thing, I've made a slight adjustment. I'm going to skip the next two slides for a second. So I'm going to go to what about essential questions, because I think this will work a little bit better, the way that this is kind of flowing. Okay, so I'm going to continue on here about essential questions. Again, some of the principles according to the book. So here is what they are, all right? So these are some of the things that they're suggesting. We're going to get into what they are versus what they aren't to kind of help that perspective, what you've already built. So effectively frame, so we use them to frame our learning goals. Well, when we look at a unit and we dive into a unit, we want to think about what is the main learning of this unit. So if we want to frame that, it's more simple to do that if we're thinking just ELA, but if we want to look at, or literacy, if you want to look beyond that and look at that cross-content, that's where this comes into play. And that's how the essential question can really be best utilized, is back to that broadening component, but also framing those learning goals, because the actual language or the specific language you may use in the question is going to really direct or put them in a spot where they're going to really, students, where we're going to really consider those learning goals. They are the answers to the questions of the content that you are expecting to teach. So if you've done the understanding by design, the essential questions, there's a concept of what's called an enduring understanding. And what the original book, Understanding by Design, got to was that you establish these enduring understandings, or a lot of times they're called the student will pieces. It's the standard, the language, the skills written in the language that students can internalize. And so think of what they are, is that essential questions are the questions that you ask where the answers become what those enduring understandings are. So those student will statements. So the student will make claims or find evidence to support that, or state an opinion and then find evidence to support that opinion. So your essential question is going to go broader and above that. So another nice way to kind of calibrate essential questions is to think about, when you ask it, are the answers going to be those student enduring understandings? They are doorways or lenses, so in other words, it's kind of a kickoff or a way to kind of set the stage for learning. And when it uses this concept of doorway, the component of that is back to what we got into, that open-ended, that broad piece, because once you get kids going, you don't know how far they're going to take the learning. There's a certain point where you expect it to go, and you always hear the great success stories where the kids take it and especially with project-based learning, you see like a good driving question and they turn something around. I happened to see one that was around recycling. And so the kids turned it into, they were doing a compost recycling with worms, and they expanded it to start including other things, and people started bringing in, so they went from just composting to recycling. And then they started like a paper drive, and they started selling donuts to buy materials or make connections with people in the community. And so it really went further. And so in that example of that doorway, a lot of times with these project-based learning examples, that's a great example of a doorway or a lens being open, where just a simple essential question resulted in this huge school-wide movement to move things forward. And then back to that transferable ideas piece. So what is something that's going to transcend all of our content pieces? So that's what they really get at. Here is what they are not. Now, understand, don't take this literally and say, oh, I don't need these things. No, not at all. But when we're talking about essential questions and the concepts we've talked about that so far, don't get that confused with these questions. There's absolutely a place for these questions along getting to the end result of an essential question. But if you find, and it's a great thing to keep in mind, and you'll do models later, but take a look at the question you've written. Is it a leading question? Is it a guiding question? Or is it kind of that anticipatory set question to get the kids thinking? If it's one of those types of questions, chances are it's time to go back and maybe make some edits or adjustments to it. And I think that's another thing to consider, is that a lot of times there's a lot of work that goes into it. Like I mentioned, when I first wrote my first essential question, I felt like it was terrible, but I clunked my way through it. And at the end, I went back and made multiple adjustments until it was where I think I really hit the mark. And sometimes it even took me trying it or implementing it, and then I made adjustments on the fly. I already made some adjustments in the way the slides were today. So, okay. Yeah. Okay, so that gets into that kind of piece. So the next piece then is, and we'll briefly touch on this, but this whole concept of intent versus form, right? So I've talked a lot about really the form and some of the things to consider, and that's a lot of what we spend our time on. So we're going to come up with this great essential question. It's going to have all these qualities. It's going to look like that. What we have to be careful of, though, is not to lose that intent. And as you're seeing in the slide, the intent is what is the true learning that we want to come from that. So sometimes focusing on getting the perfect form or the perfect essential question can lose sight of where we're going. And so it's always a good idea to take a step back and say, is this really getting at what we want the students to learn, back to those enduring understandings or what the students are going to pull. That's something that can sometimes be a challenge to lose sight of. And so this is just a reminder of that. Even as we're striving to come up with the perfect essential question, let's take a step back and look at what was the intent and what was the learning, and did we get that with the essential question we've created. And then this concept of size and scope. What this really comes down to is, I've talked a lot about it's got to be open, it's got to be broad, it's got to be a doorway. The key thing here is to keep those into consideration, but to also temper them. So what is it that your intent is? And so, like you would in doing any kind of thinking around a unit or a lesson or a particular content you're going to cover, you want to kind of set a framework. And you want to kind of say, okay, so how big do I want this to go? So how deep do I want the students to dig into the learning? And then how wide do I want to go? So what's the size or the depth, and then the scope? So how many content areas do I want to try? Now, we talked about transferring across content areas, but do I want it to go across science and social studies with literacy embedded? Or maybe that's too much. And so considering that size and scope component can sometimes shut down that essential questions. Because if we go too big in size, or too deep, I should say, or too broad in scope, then you kind of get lost in where are we going to go with this? And so it's not a bad idea to take a step back and to really look at, what that looks like, and not getting too detailed, but then not being too broad. And so that balance, too, is something to keep into consideration. So a lot of talking at you, a lot of giving you stuff there for a second. I'm going to jump back now to those slides, and I'm going to have you become, based on the learning you've done so far, you're a critic. So if we go back, and I'm sorry I don't know the exact slide number, but it was the one before the little hand graphic. Should be right before that. What I want you to do, if you want to do groups of 2 or 3, you can use the slides that I shared after or before. I just want you to take a look here and say, all right, are these questions that are posed here essential questions? What I'd like you to do, and I'll check in 5 minutes, but in reading the question, if you determine yes or no, if they're essential, I want you to provide the evidence for why you think that. And it can just be a couple little ideas, but what's the evidence? So, nope, this one's not essential. Okay? Why is that not essential? And what we'll do is we'll just have you share. So be prepared to share what some of the thinking was, and we'll have each of the 6, we'll have somebody share their answer and the evidence that they had around it. Okay? Are there any questions you have? All right, go ahead.